Welcome to Fiction Flux. Today we are starting a brand new fanfic. What if Female Deku was possessed by Sukuna and took over MHA? Let's not waste any time and get started. There is an old saying in the world of cursed energy. The vessel does not choose the king. The king chooses the vessel. And on the night that Ryam and Sukuna, the king of curses, the undying sin of humanity, the most feared entity in the history of the Jujutsu world, felt the walls between his prison and something else grow thin, he did not reach for power. He did not reach for darkness. He did not reach for the kind of soul that would make a fitting throne. He reached for the one thing he had never encountered in 1,000 years of existing inside other people's bodies. Emptiness. Not weakness, not absence, not the hollow resignation of someone who had given up. True emptiness, a vessel with no walls. A soul so completely without ego, without the defensive architecture that every other human being built around themselves the moment they realized the world was dangerous, that it offered him no resistance at all. He reached through the gap between worlds and found Izumi Midoriya. And she felt him coming. That was the part no one ever expected. That was the part that changed everything. She felt him coming and she did not run. But before we get to that moment, before we get to the night the King of Curses made the worst miscalculation of his ancient existence, we need to understand the girl. Because you cannot understand what happened without understanding exactly who Izumi Midoriya was before Sukuna found her. And who she was nothing. At least that was what the world had decided. She was 14 years old when the doctor confirmed what she had already suspected for 2 years. Quirkless. The word landed in that sterile office like something dropped from a great height, heavy and irreversible and final. Her mother held her hand and cried quietly, and the doctor spoke in the careful tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis, because in the world of quirks, quirkless was a kind of death sentence. Not physical, worse, social, the erasure of potential. The door closed before you even reached it. She went home and cried for one night. One night, and then she opened a notebook and started writing. That was Izumi Midoriya. That was the thing the world kept missing when it looked at her and saw nothing. She was not resilient in the loud, dramatic way that heroes were resilient. She was resilient the way water was resilient, constantly, quietly finding every crack and filling it, wearing down stone not with force but with persistence. She took notes on every hero she had ever seen. She analyzed their techniques, their weaknesses, their moments of hesitation. She had filled 12 notebooks by the time she was 14, and not once had any of the information in those notebooks been useful to her directly, because she had no quirk to apply it to. She collected understanding the way other people collected power. It would turn out to be the most dangerous thing about her. Katsuki Bakugo hated her for it, though he would never have said that word. He would have said Deku was annoying. He would have said she was delusional. He would have said the way she looked at everything with those wide green eyes and wrote everything down and refused to stop running even when she was clearly exhausted and outmatched was pathetic. But underneath all of that, underneath the explosions and the contempt and the years of deliberate cruelty, was something that looked a lot like the fear of being outworked by someone who had no right to be that serious. She knew that, she had always known that, she didn't hold it against him. She didn't hold much against anyone, that was also the thing people missed. Izumi Midoriya had an extraordinary capacity for understanding why people were the way they were. Not excusing it, not accepting it, understanding it. The difference between those three things was the difference between a person and a saint, and she was not a saint, but she was something unusual, someone who could look at the mechanism of a person's cruelty and see the wound underneath it clearly enough that the cruelty stopped touching her the way it touched other people. She was 14 and quirkless, and had been knocked down more times than she could count, and she still wanted to be a hero. That was not delusion, that was architecture. She had built herself around that want the way you build a house around a foundation, and it held everything else up. She met All Might at 15, she asked him the question. She got the answer she needed. She trained for 10 months on a beach full of garbage until her hands had calluses on top of calluses, and her legs were different legs than the ones she had started with. She received one for all, and she nearly shattered herself the first time she used it, and she did not stop. She arrived at UA in the spring, and the world was exactly as hard as she had expected, and she was exactly as ready as someone who had prepared for everything could be. And then, 3 months in, she died for 37 seconds during a villain attack in a practical exercise that went catastrophically wrong. They brought her back, the paramedics were fast, Recovery Girl was faster, and the damage was ultimately reversible in all the ways that mattered medically. She woke up 6 hours later in the infirmary with her mother asleep in the chair beside her, and All Might standing at the window with his back to her, his shoulders in a shape she recognized as guilt. She was fine, physically. What she didn't tell anyone, what she wrote in her notebook at 2 in the morning while everyone else was asleep, was what she had experienced in those 37 seconds. Not darkness, not peace, not the quiet nothing that people who had been clinically dead sometimes described. She had felt a door in a place that had no coordinates, a door that existed in the gap between the moment her heart stopped and the moment it started again. A door with no handle on her side, and on the other side of it, something vast and ancient and deeply, profoundly awake. It had looked at her. She had looked back. And then Recovery Girl's ability had dragged her back to her body, and the door had closed, and she had spent 3 weeks trying to decide whether it had been real or a hallucination produced by oxygen deprivation in a brain under severe stress. She decided, eventually, that it didn't matter. Real or not, it had felt like information. Like a location she had been given without being told what to do with it. She filed it away, she kept training, she kept breaking herself and putting herself back together. She was 16 when Sukuna found the door again from the other side. It was a Tuesday, she was alone in the dormitory common room at midnight, working through a tactical problem in her notebook when she felt it. Not a presence exactly, more like a change in atmospheric pressure. The way the air feels different before a thunderstorm, heavier, charged, expectant. She put her pen down and sat very still and felt it grow stronger. She recognized it. The door, the same door, opening. Every rational thought she had said to move. Said to call Aizawa, call All Might, call anyone, because whatever was on the other side of that sensation was not small, and was not friendly, and was not something a 16-year-old girl with one borrowed quirk she was still learning to control should face alone. She sat still, because underneath the rational thoughts was something else. Something that had been sitting in her chest since that night in the infirmary, patient and waiting, knowing something she hadn't caught up to yet. And that something said, "You've been here before, you survived it before. And it chose you then and it's choosing you again, and the question is not whether it's dangerous. The question is what you're going to do with dangerous." She felt Sukuna enter the room. Not physically, there was no dramatic manifestation, no sudden darkness, no crack in the air. It was subtler than that and more total, like being submerged. Like the moment a wave closes over your head and everything becomes different, the pressure, the light, the sound, and you are in a different element than the one you were built for. She felt him everywhere at once, ancient, enormous, sharp as a blade left in ice for 1,000 years. And she felt him pause. She had not screamed, she had not run, she had not done any of the things that his previous vessels had done, the panic, the fight, the desperate internal scrambling for any corner of the mind they could protect. She was sitting cross-legged on a common room sofa at midnight with a notebook on her lap, and she had felt him coming and she had stayed. "Interesting," said a voice inside her skull. It did not sound like her voice. It was lower, older, carrying in it the specific tone of someone who had not been surprised in a very long time being surprised. "I know what you are," she said aloud. She had read everything she could find about jujutsu curses after the door incident. She had not known what she was looking for exactly, but she had been thorough. She was always thorough. "You're the king of curses." The presence shifted, not retreating, recalibrating. She felt him move through her awareness the way a large animal moves through a small space, carefully, not out of consideration but out of assessment, testing walls, finding out what he was working with. "I have been called worse," said the voice that was not her voice. "You want to possess me," she said. "I want to consume you," he corrected, with a precision that would have been chilling if she had room left for chilling. "There is a difference." "What's the difference?" "Possession implies cooperation. I do not cooperate." She thought about that for a moment. "You picked me specifically," she said. "Out of everyone, you found the door in me. Why?" "Because you have no defenses," he said, and the contempt in it was the contempt of someone explaining something to a creature they considered beneath explanation. "You are empty, an open door. You do not know yet what a liability that is." "Or what an advantage," she said. "Silent. Not the silence of nothing, the silence of something very large going very still." "What did you say?" "You've been inside other people before," she said. She was thinking out loud now, the way she always did when she was working through a problem, the way that drove Bakugo insane and made Uraraka smile because it meant she was on to something. "You've fought them for control, you've broken them, but you've never had a vessel who had nothing to fight back with, nothing to protect, no ego, no pride, no power to cling to." "Correct," he said slowly, as if the word tasted strange. "So when you try to take control," she said, "you're going to find that there's nothing to push against. You can't win a war if the other side won't fight, and you can't consume something that's already completely open." The presence inside her shifted again. This time it felt different, not recalculating. She felt, for just a moment, something that might have been, if you used the word loosely, if you allowed that something 1,000 years old and entirely beyond ordinary human emotion could approximate it, uncertainty. "You are not afraid," said Sukuna. "I'm terrified," she corrected honestly, "but fear and resistance are different things." He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "This will be unpleasant for you." "Most things worth doing are," she said. She felt him settle. Not into her the way he had settled into Itadori. Not the way a conqueror takes a city, brutal and total, and marking every surface with evidence of victory. He settled the way water settles, filling the available space, taking the shape of the container, becoming indistinguishable from it, and yet remaining entirely, fundamentally, itself. She felt him everywhere at once, and she let him, and she did not disappear. That was the part he had not predicted. She did not disappear. She sat on the common room sofa and felt the king of curses exist inside her body alongside everything she was. And she was still there, still Izumi Midoriya, still the girl with the green hair and the notebooks and the borrowed power she was still learning to use. And he was there too, and the space they occupied together was not a battleground. It was something neither of them had a word for yet. "How," he said, and it was the first time she had heard something in his voice that was not contempt or calculation. "I told you," she said, "empty doesn't mean absent." She went to bed, she fell asleep. She felt him examining her memories the way someone examines a room they have been given permission to enter, thoroughly, without pretense of courtesy, but also without the destruction of someone who expects to need to fight their way out. He found the notebooks, all 22 of them, organized in her memory with an indexing system she had developed at age 12. He went through them with a methodical patience she recognized as his version of interest, which was more frightening than most people's fascination. She let him. In the morning, she felt different. Not possessed, not overwritten. Not the hollow horror that Yuji Itadori had described in the brief accounts she had found online. The way Sukuna felt like a tyrant occupying the house of your body, throwing your furniture and rewriting your walls. She felt instead like she had added a room to herself. A room she had not built and would not have chosen, and which contained things she did not fully understand yet but could feel the edges of. She felt cursed energy for the first time. It was nothing like One for All. One for All was a fire, gathered, directed, bright. Cursed energy was something that lived below fire, below light. It was the energy of living beings and their accumulated grief and fear and rage, compressed into something that had weight and temperature and will, and it sat in her body now like a second circulatory system she had never known was possible. She felt it, and her analytical mind immediately began cataloguing it. "You are doing it again," said Sukuna, somewhere in the back of her awareness. He was always there now. She was getting used to the specific texture of his presence, the way you get used to a scar, always there, always a reminder, but no longer shocking. "Doing what?" "Taking notes." "Yes," she said. He made a sound she couldn't classify, not a laugh, not contempt, something between them that had no name. "She went to class." The first person to notice was Aizawa. Of course it was. He noticed on the second day, not because she did anything dramatic, but because she was still, in a way she hadn't been before. The constant undercurrent of anxious motion, the fidgeting, the notebook reaching, the small perpetual evidence of a nervous system on high alert was gone. She sat in her seat and listened, and her eyes were the same green they had always been, and her expression was the same focused attention it had always been, but there was a quality to the stillness that made him stop mid-sentence once and just look at her. She looked back. He kept teaching. He came to her afterward. She had expected it. He stood in the doorway of the classroom after everyone else had filed out and said, "Something happened." "Not a question." "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't ask if you were fine." She looked at him, she thought about what to say. She had spent the night preparing several versions of this conversation, and none of them felt right because none of them were true, and she had found, since Tuesday night, that she had a much lower tolerance for things that weren't true. She thought that might be his influence. Sukuna had a great many qualities she would not have chosen, but a hatred of pretense was not the worst of them. "Something changed," she said. "I'm working on understanding it. When I do, I'll tell you." Aizawa looked at her for a very long time. He had the eyes of someone who had taught heroes long enough to know the difference between a student who was hiding something dangerous and a student who was processing something real, and she held his gaze and let him look, because she had nothing to hide in the sense of intending harm. She had something to understand. Those were different things. He let her go. He kept watching her. She felt his attention like a specific texture in the air when he was nearby, and she filed it under things to manage carefully. The training exercise 3 weeks later was the first time Sukuna intervened. She hadn't asked him to. She had in fact been quite specific in her internal architecture of their arrangement, a phrase she used deliberately, because arrangement implied negotiation and negotiation implied two parties withstanding, and she was very carefully constructing the premise that he was a partner rather than a parasite because she believed, based on everything she had observed about his personality in 3 weeks of cohabitation, that the only thing Ryoma and Sukuna respected was a framing he couldn't dismiss. The arrangement was, she remained primary. He was present, he did not act without her awareness. He had agreed, which had surprised her until she realized he was not agreeing out of deference but out of interest. He wanted to see what she would do with access to cursed energy and a brain that worked the way hers did. He was observing. She was his experiment as much as he was hers. The villain who appeared during the practical exercise had not been part of the plan. He had gotten through UA security in a way that the investigation afterward would determine had required both inside information and a level of preparation that spoke to something larger than a lone attack. But in the moment all she knew was that the exercise had stopped, and there was a real person with a real destructive quirk taking down the walls of the training ground, and 3 of her classmates were already hurt, and she could feel, through the precise tactical awareness Sukuna had been quietly expanding in her since Tuesday, that Aizawa was 60 meters away and not close enough. She moved. She used one for all, the way she always did, the way she had trained. But this time as she moved, she felt Sukuna lean into it, not taking control, not overriding her but adding something to the current. Like a hand on the back of a bicycle, not steering, just pushing. She felt the cursed energy flow into the one for all output, and something happened that she had no training for and no framework to understand. The punch she threw when she reached the villain did not just hit him. It unmade the next 3 seconds of his attack pattern. She couldn't describe it better than that. It was like the hit had traveled not just through space but through intention, had struck not just his body but the structure of what he was about to do, and he stood there stunned in a way that no physical blow should have produced. And she stood there equally stunned, because she had not known that was possible, and she needed to write it down immediately. Later, she wrote it down later. She restrained him with a provisional capture technique, and the exercise ended and the investigation began, and she sat with Recovery Girl and answered questions with her voice very calm and her hands very still, and Sukuna in the back of her awareness, doing something she eventually identified as satisfaction. "You are faster than I expected," he said. "At what?" "Integration." She wrote that down too. The weeks after the incident were complicated. No one could explain what had happened to the villain. His medical examination showed impact trauma consistent with a physical strike, but also evidence of something the UA medical staff filed under unknown energy interaction and escalated to the commission. Aizawa sat across from her in a small room and asked her again, and this time she told him more, not everything, but more. She told him about the cursed energy. She explained it in the terms she had built over 3 weeks of analysis, and she watched his face go through several stages: disbelief, calculation, alarm, and then the specific controlled neutrality that meant he was putting his feelings aside to assess the practical problem. She respected that about him. She always had. "This entity," he said, "Sukuna, is it dangerous?" "Yes," she said. "To you?" She thought about that carefully. "Not currently." "To others?" She met his eyes. "That depends on me." He sat with that for a long time. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned from Sukuna of all sources that silence was a form of information, and filling it before it was ready was a way of giving things away. "Can it be removed?" Aizawa said finally. "I don't know," she said, which was true. She hadn't tried. She wasn't sure she wanted to yet, and she was not yet ready to examine why. Aizawa filed a report. She knew what the report contained because she had a great deal more situational awareness than she used to have, and the Commission's response came back in 4 days, which was fast, which meant the words "cursed energy" had done something significant to someone's threat assessment. The response was a monitoring protocol. She read it carefully. She thought about what it meant. She thought about the word monitoring and the word protocol and the gap between those words and the word contained, which did not appear in the document but which she felt in the shape of it. "Sukuna," she said internally. "What?" "They're going to watch us very carefully from now on." "Good," he said in a tone she was starting to recognize as his version of a smile. "Let them watch. They will learn something." She went back to training. The next 6 months were the most intense of her life, and her life had not previously lacked intensity. She trained one for all the way she always had, brutally, systematically, pushing the limit every session and setting the new limit as tomorrow's floor. But now she also trained with Sukuna, in the space inside her own awareness where they coexisted, learning the grammar of cursed energy the way she had always learned everything, by taking it apart until she understood each piece and then rebuilding it her own way. Sukuna was not a patient teacher. He was not a teacher at all in any conventional sense. He was more like a phenomenon she had access to, massive, indifferent, operating according to rules she had to reverse engineer from observation. But he was consistent, which was more than she had expected. He did not lie. He did not misdirect. He provided information when asked with the specific kind of honesty that came not from virtue, but from contempt for the effort of deception. Why lie to someone you don't consider a threat? And despite the arrangement, despite 3 months of cohabitation, despite the fact that she was integrating his energy and adapting his techniques, and had figured out, 7 weeks in, how to weave cursed energy amplification into one for all without destabilizing either one. He did not consider her a threat. She was fine with that. Underestimation had always been her most reliable tool. She was quirkless, and the world had written her off, and she had used that to prepare in silence until she was ready. She had learned from the best. The first time she used the full integration in public, she was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to stop a massacre. The Paranormal Liberation Front's assault on the city had been building for months, she knew. She had seen the pattern in the news, in the hero response times, in the specific shape of incidents that looked unrelated until you mapped them together. She had told Aizawa 4 weeks ago. She had told him specifically which district, which timeframe, which targets. He had passed the information up the chain. The chain had moved too slowly, as chains did. The assault began on a Thursday afternoon. She was already there. Not because she had been sent, because she had looked at the data and calculated the probability and made a decision that the arrangement with Sukuna, who had, over 6 months, evolved from a presence she tolerated to something she would not precisely call an ally but which occupied the adjacent space, had made her capable of a kind of action the hero system was not designed for. The Liberation Front's vanguard arrived at the central plaza in numbers she felt before she saw. 43 combatants, 14 distinct quirk signatures in the first wave, and behind them, managing them, the specific focused malice of someone who had put months into planning and believed in what they were doing. She stepped into the plaza alone. The heroes were 12 minutes out. She had 12 minutes. She began. What happened in those 12 minutes would later be described in commission reports in language so carefully clinical that the clinicalness itself communicated the depth of discomfort the writers felt. Subject demonstrated combat capabilities inconsistent with known training history. Energy signatures present do not match registered quirk profile. Estimated capacity appears significantly beyond parameters previously assessed. What actually happened was this. She moved through 43 combatants, with one for all carrying her speed and Sukuna's cursed energy shaping every strike into something that went beyond the physical. Not lethal. She had been very precise about that in her internal architecture of the arrangement. Sukuna found non-lethality mildly boring and entirely her prerogative, and he had not argued, which she had taken to mean he was more invested in watching her operate than in the outcome of any specific fight. She hit people and they stayed down, not from damage, from a kind of certainty, the specific conviction of having been touched by something so far outside your category of experience that your body made the intelligent decision to stop. She reached the commander in 4 minutes. She had left 38 conscious, unhurt, and quietly cooperating with the understanding that staying still was the correct option. The commander was powerful, a combination quirk that let him restructure the density of anything he touched, which was genuinely terrifying, and which she had been thinking about how to counter since she saw the signature 40 minutes ago. He touched her. She felt him try to restructure the density of her bones. She felt Sukuna's energy run through her skeleton like current through wire, and the restructuring attempt bounced off something that was not her quirk and not exactly his, and was the specific product of 6 months of integration that had produced something new, something neither one for all nor cursed energy alone, something she still didn't have a name for. She looked at him very calmly. She put 2 fingers against his sternum. She used the technique she had been developing for 3 months, the one that combined one for all's concentrated force output with a cursed energy compression that she had reverse engineered from Sukuna's domain expansion principles without actually accessing a domain, a thing which he had told her was impossible and which she had done anyway after 4 weeks of trying. It produced a point impact that felt on the receiving end like being struck by something that weighed more than the world. He sat down, extremely fast. He was not unconscious. He was sitting on the ground looking at her with an expression she had seen before, the specific expression of someone whose understanding of what was possible had just been revised without their consent. The heroes arrived at minute 11. She stepped back into the crowd before they could identify her clearly. This was deliberate. She was not ready. Not for the commission, not for the monitoring protocol that would immediately escalate, not for the conversation that would come with being seen doing what she had just done. She needed more time. Sukuna, as she slipped away through the chaos, said something he had never said before. "That was well done." She stopped walking for just a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I didn't do that. You did." She kept walking. She found a rooftop 6 blocks away and sat down and wrote 4 pages of notes. Her hands were steady. That was new too. 6 months ago her hands shook after fights. She had attributed it to adrenaline. She thought now it might have been fear, not of the fight, but of herself, of what she was capable of the gap between what she wanted to be and what she was becoming. The gap had closed. She wasn't sure when. She wasn't afraid of herself anymore. She thought about how to feel about that and found that she felt mostly clear. The commission's monitoring escalated anyway. Footage from the plaza attack had been analyzed and a silhouette identified, a movement pattern cross-referenced. She knew because Ragdoll, the former pro-hero whose search ability she had encountered briefly and studied extensively, had a successor in the commission's intelligence division, and that successor's reports were not as secure as they believed. She had 3 weeks before they moved. She used them. She found every piece of information she had gathered over 6 months of paying attention to the shape of the hero system from the outside. She mapped it the way she had mapped villain networks, not with hostility, but with the specific clear-eyed neutrality of someone who needed to understand a structure before they could decide what to do with it. She found the funding flows. She found the political architecture. She found the 32 active cases where heroes had been dispatched not to protect civilians, but to protect commission interests. She found 6 cases where known threats had been deliberately left unaddressed because addressing them would complicate ongoing operations. She wrote it all down. And then she did something that no one expected. She sent it to every major news organization in Japan. Not anonymously, with a name, not Izumi Midoriya. She was not ready for that, and the people she needed to reach were not yet ready to hear that name attached to what she was. She sent it as someone new, someone the world didn't have a category for. She signed it with a single word. Vessel. The commission's response was immediate, and it was panic dressed as procedure. She felt it like a change in weather, the sudden activation of hero teams, the encrypted communication bursts, the specific quality of institutional fear that feels different from individual fear because it moves more slowly and has more momentum and is much, much harder to stop. Aizawa called her. She answered. "Midoriya," he said. His voice was the voice of someone who had been awake for 36 hours and had made peace with it. "Are you safe?" She was on a rooftop. She was always on a rooftop now. She found them clarifying. "Yes," she said. "What are you doing?" She thought about how to answer that. She looked out at the city. She could feel it, the quirk signatures, the lives, the enormous complicated ecosystem of human power and human fear, and underneath it all, running through it the way a river runs through land it has carved over centuries, the dark current of cursed energy that most people would never feel and which she had learned to read like a language. She could feel Sukuna, present and quiet, watching through her eyes the way he always watched now, not to take control, not to intervene, just to see what she would do next. His patience had evolved from the patience of an apex predator waiting for prey into something else, something that felt in its particular alien way like respect. "I'm changing things," she said to Aizawa. "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have right now." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him breathe. She heard, in that breath, the weight of a man who had taught children to be heroes for long enough to know when one of them had become something the category of hero couldn't hold. "Come in," he said. "Talk to us. Whatever you're doing, do it with us." "I tried that," she said gently. "The Category 7 containment request, remember?" Silent. "I'm not your enemy," she said. "I'm not anyone's enemy, but I'm going to finish what I started." She paused. "Tell All Might I'm okay, if he asks." She ended the call. She opened the newest notebook. She had stopped numbering them. She just dated them now. She wrote for 2 hours. She wrote about the hero system and what it could be if the parts of it that served power instead of people were removed. She wrote about quirks and what they meant and what they were, and what the world had turned them into and what they could be instead. She wrote about cursed energy and what it told her about the nature of grief and fear in human society, that those two things had become so abundant, so structural, so fundamental to the experience of existing in this world that they had spontaneously generated entities, had produced the Sukuna inside her as a kind of antibody, and what that said about what needed to change. She wrote about herself. She wrote, "I am not what I was. I am not what anyone expected. I am something built from emptiness and borrowed power, and the longest conversation of my life with the thing that was supposed to consume me. I don't know what to call this. I don't know what comes next." She paused. She wrote, "But I know what I want. I want a world where no 14-year-old girl sits in a doctor's office and is told she is nothing. I want a world where power does not determine worth. I want a world where the system designed to protect people is actually designed to protect people, and not just the version of people that power finds convenient." She stopped writing. She felt Sukuna, quiet and close, reading over her shoulder in the way he sometimes did when she was writing things that caught his interest. "Ambitious," he said. "Yes," she said. "For a girl who once apologized to the person who knocked her down," he said, and there was something in it that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. She smiled. That surprised her, not the feeling but the ease of it. 6 months ago, she would have been horrified to find herself smiling at something Ryomen Sukuna said. "I'm not that girl anymore," she said. "No," he agreed, "you are not." She stood up. She looked out at the city, at the lights and the movement, and the million living signatures of the world she had decided she was going to change, not by breaking it apart, but by understanding it completely, deeply, structurally, the way she had always understood everything from the ground up. She was 17 years old. She had inside her the accumulated power of 100+ ultra generations, and the cursed energy of the most dangerous entity the Jujutsu world had ever produced, and 23 notebooks of analysis, and a plan she was still writing. She was not afraid. She felt Sukuna beside her, not behind her, not above her, beside her, and she thought about what it meant that the King of Curses had tried to consume an empty vessel, and found instead a partner. Not by design, not because he had wanted that, because she had offered him something he had never encountered in 1,000 years of existence inside broken, fighting, desperate human beings. She had offered him honesty. And below the city, below the lights, below the Commission's encrypted signals, and the heroes' patrol routes and the villain networks she had already begun to dismantle piece by piece, she felt something shift, something in the architecture of what was possible, some door opening that had never been opened before. She had felt a door once, in 37 seconds between one heartbeat and the next. She had walked through it. And somewhere in the world, somewhere beyond the edge of her current awareness, somewhere in the dark that was still coming, she could feel the next door. She would be ready. She was always ready. That was it for today. Hope you liked this one. Comment for part 2 and don't forget to subscribe and share. See you in the next one.